We could take questions for like 10 minutes and then we'll call it a day. So, and you can ask me a question about anything you want.
This goes back a bit to the beginning of the lecture, but how does morality go from who's stronger and who's weaker to what's good and what isn't?
Well, I think it depends to some degree on what you mean by stronger. So physical strength is one element, and like if you look at mythological heroes, imagine that the stories of heroes are fragmented elements of the archetype. And so one kind of archetypal hero obviously is someone who's physically strong. You know, you see that there's a great movie that you could watch about this. It's called Hitman Hart. It's one of the best documentaries I've ever seen, and it's about this guy named Bret Hart. And Bret Hart was for a while the most famous Canadian on the planet, and he was a worldwide wrestling foundation, I think. What did they call that? WWF? Yeah. He was their like lead good guy. And so wrestling, I loved the documentary because when I was a little kid, like 4 or 5, I used to watch his father, whose name was Stu Hart, who ran this channel, this wrestling confederation in Alberta. And Stu Hart had, I think, 8 boys, and he trained all of them to be pro wrestlers. And part of the movie is extraordinarily funny because Stu Hart is in it, and he's really old. He's like 85, and he's just barely, can you imagine? He was like a pro wrestler for 40 years. Like every joint is broken. And he's still big, but he's just barely moving. And this kid and another kid come over, and Stu is telling the story about how he used to take his boys into the basement and toughen them up. And I think Bret called that the journey to pain or something like that. His father would take all these kids down there and wrestle with them and push them right to the edge of their pain tolerance constantly. And anyways, they grew up tough. There's no doubt about that. And all his daughters married pro wrestlers too, and I think he had 7 daughters. So he's quite the character. Anyways, these 2 kids, they're late adolescence, early adulthood, come over, and one of them's pretty damn cocky. And he's listening to Stu, and he says something smart like, well, you know, you were pretty tough with the old days, hey? And Stu looks at him and says, well, why don't you come down to the basement with me? And he says, well, look, I don't want to hurt you, old man. And so the filmmakers follow them into the basement, eh? And like they're kind of standing there, and the old guy grabs him in a headlock and takes him like, he's like a snake, eh? He's got him in a headlock like so fast, and the kid doesn't know what to do. And then, so Stu, like, who knows how to put a headlock on someone, he's like flexing his forearm, yeah, which is like still not so bad a forearm. And he's got, this guy's face is just, he's like he's stepped in a bear trap, plus he's absolutely shocked that this old guy got him. And so he's kind of gasping. And Stu says something like, you watch, if I flex this muscle just right, you can see this vein on his forehead start to pop out. It's extraordinarily funny. Anyways, Bret Hart plays out the good guy archetype. And Bret's, like, he's a solid guy, but I would say he's not particularly sophisticated, and I'm not being cruel about that. I mean, he had a great career, and he's tough as a boot, and so good for him. But he plays out this good guy archetype, and he gets tangled up in it. And now, I don't remember your damn question, but I am trying to answer it. Tell me the question again.
So I was wondering how, in reality, you go from who's strongest and who's weakest to what's good and what isn't.
Oh yes, okay, exactly. Well, so one of the things I really liked about this movie was it showed me why people watched wrestling, and I couldn't because certainly they're not appealing, and I'm not being, there are different strata of conception of abstraction that any entertainment process has to appeal to. And you know, most people don't go to movies. And that's actually because, it really is because movies operate at a level of sophistication that is too high for many people. Just like novels. I mean, hardly anyone reads, you know, and if you, about 15% of the population, might be 20%, cannot read well enough to follow written instructions. And so, and people who are, maybe it's 15% of the population or 10%, have never finished a book, never. And so, and it is that high. But you still, the archetype still needs to manifest itself at different levels, and so it manifests itself in wrestling. But even there, where it is physical force, it's not just physical force. Like, it's a drama between good and evil. And you can see this so clearly in the Bret Hart documentary, because he's the good guy, and the bad guys are really over the top bad. It's a real drama. It's like, it's good versus evil in the ring every time. And hopefully good wins, but good often gets, maybe the bad wrestler brings 2 of his friends in and they bring in chairs and they bash the hell out of the good guy. And the whole audience is just outraged by this. And the documentary does a lovely job of showing that. But so even at the level of physical combat, let's say, you can't reduce what's good to what's strong. It's just one element of it. Better to be strong than to be weak. And so you can have a strong hero because it's better to be strong than to be weak. But it's better to be strong and kind than to be strong. And it's better to be strong and kind and wise than to be strong and kind. And that's true not only for human beings, but it's even true, let's say, at the wolf or the chimpanzee level. Because one of the things you see with the chimp dominance hierarchies, and I think I mentioned this before, is if the leader, the dominant male, is really good at fostering social relations and being reciprocal in acts like grooming, and also paying attention to the females and their offspring, his dynasty will be much more stable. And so strong might be good for 1 battle, it might be good for 2 battles, but for 50 battles, it's not optimized. Especially because no matter how strong you are, someone can take you out. So what happens is, the idea of what's ideal becomes increasingly complex across time, multifaceted, right? And so strength, wisdom, intelligence, vision, all these things are amalgamated into a single being. And we'll talk a lot about that, because I want to show you how that happened in Mesopotamia, because that's one of the first places where we have documentation about how that ideal emerged. They have a god called Marduk, and Marduk had 50 names. And as far as I can tell, the reason for that was that Marduk was an amalgam of the tribal deities of at least 50 tribes. And when the tribes were brought together and civilized, each of their gods who were ideals had to be amalgamated into something that was a single dramatized representation of value, or there was no way that all those people could have lived together, right? Their different value structures would have fragmented them and they would have stayed in a state of war. And so the question is, it's the question you're asking. If it's not strength, then what is it? Well, strength is an element, but the Egyptians figured out that it was vision. It was actually the capacity to pay attention. That was paramount. And the Mesopotamians had that figured out more or less too, because their god Marduk had eyes all the way around his head. He could see everywhere. So seeing was a critical element of what should be on top. And the other thing for the Mesopotamians was the ability to speak. So by the time of Mesopotamia, people had already dramatized the idea that cardinal human attributes are vision and the ability to speak. So, and that be the ability to speak the truth too, not just speak. So, other questions?
So, I mean, I wasn't really aware of what you just sort of said, that most people don't watch movies, because I've probably watched so many movies, I just think it's commonplace. So is that why we sort of consider, because we were talking celebrity earlier, that different levels of abstraction of celebrity are respected more, like reality TV probably lower than, a
Sure.
Cumberbatch, than a theater actor, than like a novelist, and like.
Yes, that's exactly why. Because you see, the less sophisticated the genre, the more the genre is like real life. And the more sophisticated it is, the more it has abstracted out across instances of real life the fundamental lessons. And that's what makes something profound and deep. It's abstracted from multiple sources and it applies across multiple dimensions. Because that's what you want. It's like, and here's why, fundamentally. It's like, you have a problem, but that's not the problem. The problem is that there are problems. So the problem is a meta problem. There are problems. You need a solution to that. That's not a solution to a problem. That's a meta solution to the class of problems. Right, and that's what people have been trying to figure out ever since we were able to actually figure things out. It's not how do you solve a problem. It's how do you act so that you solve the problem of problems. And that's basically at least the complexity of life and the fact that you're mortal and vulnerable. So
So then a follow-up question. From your book, you have this sort of strata from play all the way up to religion, and beyond that, sort of looking back retroactively with philosophy and rationality.
Yes. Well, that's a good one. It's a good. I would say the best way, if you really want to think this through, the best way to do that is to read Nietzsche and Dostoevsky at the same time. Now, I'm sure there's other ways of doing this, but Nietzsche was actually quite heavily influenced by Dostoevsky, more than people knew, although their thought runs very parallel. And so Dostoevsky is like the ultimate dramatist, right? He embodies his ideas and he has them act out in a dramatic space. It's literary. Whereas Nietzsche has taken that up one level of abstraction to the semantic. He says, well, here's what's going on in an articulated way, but he doesn't embody it in the story. And you might say, well, that's higher, but it's only higher in a way. It's more abstract in that it's more like words, whereas what Dostoevsky does is half words and half images, right? Because when you read a novel, what happens is that people say, and the postmodernists say, well, where the hell's the meaning in that novel? It's like, it's not in the word, it's not in the phrase, it's not in the sentence, it's not in the paragraph, you know, where do you localize the meaning? It's a great question. Their answer sucks, but the question's great. So, but what happens partly when you're reading a book is that, a novel, is that the words trigger representations in your imagination, and a lot of the information from which, a lot of what you extract the information from is actually your imagistic representation of the words. And that imagistic representation is richer than the words because it's informed by all of your knowledge about people. And so you know this happens because you go to a movie like the Harry Potter movies and you say, that's not how I imagined it. Right? The probability that there'll be a one-to-one correspondence between your internal representation of the book and the movie is 0. And usually the movie is less rich than the book. I mean, I love movies and they have their own place, that's for sure, but well, miniseries, the series now are more approaching the complexity and depth of literature because they can extend across 20 hours, you know, and, you know, they don't have to compress a 12-hour reading experience into 2 hours of action. So yeah, and so what I was trying to do with that hierarchy was to show how the knowledge moved. Like, first of all, it's kind of implicit in your biology, and then it's distributed into society, and then by imitating society you make it part of your procedures, and then you watch your own procedures and start to build a representation of them, and then you can articulate that representation. And it's a bootstrapping process too, because once you've made the representation, that can affect the way you behave, and so they start to loop. And so, so here's one idea. So imagine that there's a type of male who tends to win dominance hierarchy contests and to merge at the top. Well, that's the case. That is the case, and that's why you're the way you are. And so what's happened among human beings, this is so cool, is that human females are choosy maters. So about twice as many men fail in their reproductive efforts as females fail. Okay, but the men who succeed are more successful. So women are on average more successful, and men are on average more failures and more successful. And I'm talking strictly about reproduction here, although it generalizes to other areas, but I'm talking about reproduction. So how does it work exactly? Well, the women have a real problem with mate selection. It's like, who the hell are you going to have as a mate? And it's too complex to work out, so women in their genius don't. They let the men compete and then they peel from the top, acting out the assumption that the man who wins is the best man. And it's a good assumption, because if you have a bunch of men competing, especially if they're competing across competitions, and someone pops up at the top, you can think, well, they may not be worth much, but they're better than anyone else at whatever it is that they're doing. And that makes men at the top of dominance hierarchies very attractive to women. And then the women accelerate that, so you can imagine they're more likely to reproduce. And so what happens is that the proclivity to emerge at the top of the set of dominance hierarchies becomes inbuilt into the biology across time. And the women exaggerate that by differentially allowing the men to reproduce. And that's also why they're Mother Nature. They really are Mother Nature. It's not just a metaphor. And so then the representation and the biology start to tangle together. And that's like, well, that's the difference between a meme and an archetype. right? A meme is this idea that propagates itself, but an archetype is an idea that has propagated itself across such a massive span of time that it's actually shaped the course of evolution itself. And men, I can tell you already how this, it isn't necessarily that you even have to compete with other men in order to see who wins. As soon as you admire someone, and that'll happen unconsciously, you won't be able to stop yourself. You've already elevated them in the dominance hierarchy contest. The act of admiration is your recognition that you've met someone who's better at whatever it is that happens to be driving your admiration than you are. And so, and that's partly the manifestation of just the idea as the what would you say, as the representation of the ideal. And kids do that all the time. They hero worship other kids. Usually, like a 4-year-old will latch onto some 6-year-old who will just follow, or she'll follow everywhere and do exactly what they do. And it's like, well, why? Well, because that person represents to that child their next ideal, their conceptualization of the place forward. So okay. Any other questions, or should we maybe call it a day? Okay.
When you said that the guy who was smiling at the thing was predatory glee, and that,
Yeah.
Which is insanity. How do you define insanity in this context?
Well, let's call it what you don't want to encounter alone in an alley at midnight, and leave it at that.
I mean,
But that is what I mean in this context. That's exactly what I mean. And then not only is the person there waiting for you, but they're looking forward to whatever might happen.
yeah, for sure. I just mean like in a psychological context, using that word "saying" has like its own connotations. So I was making sure I wasn't interpreting it in the wrong way.
No, well, the movie provides the frame for the interpretation in this particular situation. And so he's the thing that hauls naive young boys off to their doom. Okay, so that's bounded. So, yes?
I have a question. I would like you, if you can elaborate a bit on, you talked about this mental process where people do the thing that's hard but less hard but still hard to avoid facing the shadow.
Yeah. That's actually a really productive way of procrastinating, although it comes with its own problems of rationalization.
So that reinforces certain circuits.
Yes.
And then you talk about it in a way that says that those can't go away, so you need to bring up the other inhibitory circuits. And I'm just wondering if you can elaborate.
Well, I can, sure.
What is in the realm of possibility around their understanding of it?
Well, I've derived that partly from my study of addiction and also from my study of recovery from post-traumatic stress disorder. But let's talk about addiction. So there's a series of actions that occur before you take your cocaine. Some of those are local. They're the things that happen immediately before, and some of those are distal. They're farther back in the chain of events. And when you have a hit of cocaine, it produces a dopaminergic burst, and that feels really good, but it also makes the circuits that were immediately active before that grow. That's what reinforcement is. And then the growth is proportionate, not linearly, but it's proportionate to how long before that event occurred. The closer it is, the stronger they're going to get. But even the ones that are somewhat distal get some reinforcement. Because you might say, well, what did you do before you found your latest fix? And the answer is, well, how long before? Well, the closer, the more rewarded. And so what happens then is that, so if you take that person out of the normal environment, you put them into a treatment center, they're off their physical addiction, which is a weird thing in the case of cocaine, but like not that long. A week will do it, 2 weeks for sure. Even heroin and alcohol for sure, if you can get them through the seizure part without dying. And so they're done. They aren't physiologically dependent anymore. But you let that person go, and the first thing that happens is his old friend, who he's always out doing drugs with, shows up, and bang, he's craving like mad. And that's because that thing in there is not dead at all. And it's activated by the cue. And it's a circuit. It's not. It's a personality. It only wants one thing. It wants cocaine. It's going to suppress any non-related thoughts, and it'll use lies. That's no problem, especially if lies have been reinforced, which they certainly have. Where are you off to, son? You know, you'll have a lie for that, and then 10 minutes later you have your drug, and so that little lie has just grown. Or maybe you think you've tried to quit, and you think to hell with it, and every time 10 minutes before you take your drug you think to hell with it, and you do that 1,000 times. Well, believe me, the to hell with it circuit, that sucker is strong. And so it's alive, and it's not like it just disappears. It can't. It's you. It's grown in there. Now, you can build another circuit to shut it down, and you can help it decompose across time by not giving it what it wants. But you're going to have to not give it what it wants in all of the multiple contexts that you've already associated with the drug. Some of you have probably smoked and then tried to quit smoking, and what you'll see is you get a craving when you have a cup of coffee, or when you're finished dinner, or when you're done having a phone call, or when you first get up in the morning, or whenever you've regularly had the drug, whatever you had the drug in relationship to, even complex things like ending a conversation will produce a cued craving. And so then that can extinguish over time if you punish it by either punishing it or not letting it get what it wants. But a lot you have to build another circuit to just shut it down. And then that circuit's kind of fragile, and stress can often disrupt it. So
that can be mediated by some of the books that people read about quitting smoking, or things like ibogaine and...
Oh sure, well part of that, well ibogaine's a whole different thing because it seems to have a direct physiological effect, but you know, the addiction has a cognitive component. It's full of thoughts and desires and wants, and you know, you may have to rebuild your whole personality in order to get that thing cornered. Religious conversion, for example, is a really effective treatment for alcoholism. That's partly why Alcoholics Anonymous works for the people for whom it does work. But religious conversion, which is total personality conversion, is actually one of the few things that we know of that's an effective treatment for alcoholism. We don't know how to induce it. But although that's not exactly true either, because in the early work with LSD was quite promising as a treatment for alcohol addiction. And there's recent work with psilocybin showing that if people have a mystical experience when you give them psilocybin, their success rate in quitting smoking is about 80%, which is way higher than any pharmacological intervention for smoking has ever been. So, all right, we should probably call it a day.